Hello and welcome to another episode of Brave UX. I'm Brendan Jarvis, managing founder of The Space in Between, and it's my job to help you to put the pieces of the product puzzle together. I do that by unpacking the stories, learnings, and expert advice of world-class UX design and product management professionals. My guest today is Robbie Allan. Until recently, Robbie was a group product manager at Intercom, the world's leading business conversation platform, best known for its friendly, almost omnipresent live chat icon. At Intercom, Robbie was focused on product-led growth and responsible for onboarding and first-use experiences. To put that in perspective, that's a product portfolio worth over 100 million US dollars in annual recurring revenue. Prior to joining Intercom, Robbie led the mobile product team at SurveyMonkey, where his team doubled product usage and increased core user retention. Robbie was also part of the founding team of Carnival.io, a New Zealand and New York-based mobile marketing automation startup. There, he was responsible for all things product, including the go-to-market roadmaps for sales and marketing. Carnival was sold to Sell-Through in 2015 for an undisclosed sum. Before leaving New Zealand for the USA, Robbie received the Prime Minister's Business Scholarship, where he then went on to earn an MBA from UC Berkeley in 2013. He also received the Outstanding Graduate Student Instructor Award during his time there. Robbie's writing on product management has been featured in Forbes, Fortune, Adweek, USA Today, and on the front page of Reddit. He's also generously shared his knowledge by speaking at Product Led, Mind the Product, and Product School. And today, he's here to share that knowledge with me on Brave UX. Robbie, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Brendan.
It's great to have you here, Robbie. And I always like to start off, as people know, on a serious note. And that serious note is that I understand that you learnt to fly in recent years. And that's interesting because just the other week I was speaking to Benjamin Humphrey, who's the CEO of Dovetail, and he told me a joke about pilots. Are you ready?
I'm ready. What is this?
How do you know someone's a pilot?
Presumably because they tell you.
That is 100% correct. And to be fair, you didn't tell me, but I did spot it on your Twitter bio. Why flying?
So this was actually a client of ours at Carnival one time, took us flying. And I, like a lot of people that had thought flying was interesting. If you had to have a superpower, that would absolutely be my choice over invisibility or super strength or anything like that. And I was just blown away. The experience of flying down Long Island over Jones Beach, super low in the middle of summer, it was like so beautiful and we felt so free. And I just didn't realize it was a thing that kind of normal people could do. I assumed it was either very expensive or very difficult or esoteric. And it's neither particularly cheap nor particularly easy. But as a sort of a skills acquisition thing, I really love learning new things. It's both a beautiful thing and to be able to do and unlocks a whole lot of stuff. Plus there's a lot of learning involved in it, and I just find that intrinsically fun.
And it's interesting looking at your background and actually knowing you personally. Learning is definitely something that you value and you've spent a lot of time doing. I mentioned your MBA there at UC Berkeley, but I also remember that you graduated and went to work for McKinsey, but you didn't stay in the consulting world. Instead, you made your way to Silicon Valley and into product. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I'd love to say it was a thoroughly studied decision, but it's one of those things that makes a lot of sense in retrospect. But at the time, I was just kind of following my nose. I really enjoyed management consulting. I like the idea of working with kind of large businesses on some of their hardest problems. I loved working with kind of some really interesting and extremely smart colleagues. But ultimately, I didn't like, constantly being an advisor. There's only so much you can do if you're sort of from the outside, and many times you'd see what we thought were great recommendations given to clients and they wouldn't kind of implement them. And I figured I'd just rather be on the other side of the table. I'd rather be the person in the chair making those decisions. And so the kind of arc of my career has been just closer and closer to actually being an operator, and I found that really fulfilling. Product management itself was, again, a bit of luck. So it was actually a former McKinsey colleague who connected me with the other team at Zynga. didn't really know what product management was, and didn't really think that a Facebook game would be the thing for me. So I actually worked on Farmville, which was that Facebook game that was super popular, maybe 5 or 6 years ago with the lonely cow, and they totally had hacked newsfeed and got a lot of the traffic from that. Just didn't sort of see how that would be kind of relevant to me. I wasn't interested in that. But what I was exposed to, during my time there was just how digital products is this beautiful blend of kind of creativity and solving customer problems. Like there was this real sort of qualitative element to it. But also you can measure everything that people do. And so they're highly, highly analytical. And it felt very similar in some ways to what I'd loved most about the work at McKinsey, which was like kind of trying to understand a problem, get to the bottom of it. And it's not just a spreadsheet. It's also about the qualitative, like, is this fun? Does this work? Does this make sense? Why are people, kind of doing this? Like, here's 3 items that are frequently purchased, but what's the common denominator among them? So really sort of similar problem solving thinking, but with just much more data, so much more information, we could really rapidly understand so much about how our customers were behaving to get a better picture of them. And also the ability to iterate so rapidly. So at McKinsey, you do a bunch of research over 6 or 8 weeks, you come up with a strategy, you'd implement it over 2 years, and then either the stock price went up or it didn't. Like it was a very slow iteration cycle. Whereas at, Zynga, we would, you'd have some insight, you'd spend a day doing research, you'd put together a feature that may be built in about a week or so, a couple of weeks, you'd ship it, and basically that morning, in many cases, you'd know like, hey, I'm onto something, or I'm not. And if you weren't onto something, at least you'd understand like where in the funnel people were falling off, or have just a lot of information to kind of iterate. And so that whole idea of just like kind of coming up with hypotheses and testing and learning, that was what was sort of fun about consulting, was just writ large at a digital product company, whether that's B2B software, which is where I find myself now, or a very large consumer game.
You mentioned the analytical training that you had and the experiences at McKinsey and how you loved that side of that and you could bring that forward into the experience at Zynga, but there was more of an immediacy in seeing the results of the changes that you were able to affect, and that sounds like that would be quite addictive. You also touched on the qualitative and quantitative aspects of informing design or product decisions there. When you first started at Zynga, what way did you lean, if any, between the sort of qualitative techniques and the quantitative techniques?
Like 100% quant. I think that was definitely a gap, but like Zynga was very, very analytical. And if you look at the company, it was very good at taking existing games and managing them very well, kind of something that's already working, and then really kind of optimizing that core loop. There's very few games they were able to start themselves and be very successful. And so in the sort of the core creative game design, I don't think Zynga was strong. But in terms of like managing an existing thing by the numbers, they were world class, and probably still are. And so that's the sort of, that was a great sort of introduction to kind of that world, being able to lean on my analytical skills. But at Zynga also made it very clear that there was there was this kind of element of creativity which was hard to sort of see in numbers. So for example, certain virtual goods, if you had a bunch of items, whether it's, this is sort of Farmville, so trees or sheep or dragons or, whatever, certain ones would just sell more because just the art looked good. There was this real sort of inherent taste aspect to the whole thing. And, over time you started to get good at sort of understanding your customer and having a sense. You start to build this sort of intuition of like, I think this will sell well, or like this feels like this sort of other thing. And I think I've been really fascinated over the last few years about like how you blend those things together. Because I think the quant and the qual are often seen as sort of two different lenses, where increasingly I actually think they're just sort of the same thing. It's actually all information. It's all data about our customers. And it just comes in different formats. And so the sort of distinction, should one be quant or should one be qual, I think is sort of the wrong question at this point.
Yeah, there's definitely a need and a role for both, and in order to fully understand what that user experience is like and how to evolve it. I'm interested in speaking with you in more detail about quant and qual further on in the conversation. But before we do that and we move off Zynga, I understand that your claim to fame there was you came up with virtual unicorns. Tell me about that.
Yeah, the unicorns feature. So that was really fun. We sold $500,000 of imaginary virtual unicorns in a couple of weeks. And the feature sounds super creative. There was like the fire pegacorn and the rainbow pony pegacorn and kind of unicorns and all this sort of stuff. A pegacorn is the combination of a Pegasus and a unicorn, which I don't think I knew until I worked at Zynga. But the clue is in the title. So it seems really fun, really whimsical. It's actually a microeconomics experiment at its core. So where that came from is I was just idly curious about pricing elasticity at one point. So pricing elasticity basically is the trade-off between, when you change a price, what's the relative percentage change in, kind of purchase volume relative to percentage change in price. Because the way that you maximize revenue is you want those two things to be equal. So, intuitively, it's like if something's really price sensitive, you can decrease the price just a little bit and maybe double sales, which obviously is like a really good result. Or in some cases, if our customers are pretty price inelastic, you can increase, maybe double the price and only, 10% fewer people, purchase it. And so, overall, you've kind of made more revenue. And so I was really curious about this at Zynga, and so was just trying to look at like what does the price elasticity look like for these sort of virtual goods. And what we saw is very high levels of price elasticity at low prices. So that means that as you go from like $1 to $1.10 to $1.20 for a virtual good, you see like really significant drop off in the number of people that are buying it. But after about $4 or $5, extremely price inelastic. And so, same number of people, roughly speaking, would buy something for $5 as would for $10. And so to sort of cut to the chase, the right answer there is to have a lot of really cheap items. So you'll sell like a huge amount of them at like a very low price, and a number of very expensive items because you bleed a lot of people off. Increasing from sort of $1 to $5, but if you're pricing it at $5, you might as well price it at 10 or 20. And at the time, all of our items were sort of priced in the middle at like $2 or $3, which is like the worst price, basically. And so unicorns were essentially largely a copy of the Dragons feature, but just with a new sort of set of pricing laid on top to really understand like, hey, does this theory hold true? Like if we kind of price it cheaper and much higher, can we drive more revenue? And I think we got about 30%, like a third more revenue out of a kind of a similar feature just by sort of optimizing the price in that way. And so the sort of bringing while it was fundamentally a microeconomics experiment, there were actually some really fun kind of creative aspects because certain items, what was one? The robot unicorn, I think, like was priced really high, but because the art was kind of weird and didn't really sort of resonate with customers, we actually didn't sell that many of them. So, there was some aspect in which the kind of the actual just the art and the coolness of these items was this kind of noise that was put across the, sort of core economic experiment. They weren't quite the same things, but yeah, overall it was a pretty good, a pretty fun little experiment.
And what was it like? How did it feel when you realized that you were able to adjust the price and achieve, I think you mentioned a 30% increase in sales or revenue? Like, what was that moment like?
It's a good one to focus on. It was, to this day, I still find this, right? Like when you actually get the data back and it works, I'm always a little bit amazed. It's sort of, you have so many conversations about this and you draw the chart and rah, 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 but there's just something about like being able to take a chart or an insight or whatever and make a change and see that actually reflected in human behavior. This sort of incredible sense of like, wow, I actually understand this and we can actually move the levers of this business. Like I still think it's a fairly intoxicating kind of experience, even shipping features today.
Yeah, I can understand how that might be. Yeah, there are a lot of smart people working in product, and what you've just talked about clearly comes from your training in finance and economics, and you've applied that to a large scale game in this case in order to see what works and what doesn't. And you mentioned that it was quite intoxicating. But as I said when I first started the question, there's a lot of smart people working in product, and that can often mean that there are a few egos at play. How do you manage an environment like Zynga, like other product companies where you've been in, where there are a lot of well-paid and highly intelligent people?
Yeah, so I think ego in product management is a really interesting one because increasingly it's a role that's sort of smart, capable, ambitious, people get
Mm,
attracted to. Um, but it's also a role that has a lot of influence without authority. If you're an individual contributor PM, you don't have a team, you need to have your engineering team, your designer, your researcher, your analyst, and even when I say your, it's not actually really yours in any sense, your partners,
mm,
um, they've got to kind of believe and trust you. You don't have that kind of implicit stick of like, do this or you are fired. That kind of typifies a command and control structure for like a traditional organization. These people
mm,
can go to their bosses and say, you're not doing a good job. Um, and that's even more true with like your kind of more cross-functional partners, marketing, sales, analytics, all that sort of stuff. So
mm,
it's a role in which I think it's easy to make mistakes. And like I know certainly early on in my career, and this is sort of typified of kind of MBAs and ex-consultants and stuff. And I think I was no
mm,
exception where I'd sort of try and win people over through like pure force of argument. Like that doesn't make sense. Like always appealing to um, rationality. And in many cases coming
mhm,
down really quickly on people in meetings. And it just didn't work very well.
mm,
There's a whole set of skills of influencing that are really important to learn in product. And, one of the ways I think about it now is, you know, if you, actually, this was something that our CEO at Intercom, Karen Peacock, said a lot. Like, if you want to go far, go alone. No, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together, which has got a kind of Reader's Digest feel to it. But I think, um, you know, getting the whole organization on board with something um, is extremely like it's really really important. And if there's a choice between just like do it yourself and kind of slide it through, don't talk to the analytics team, do the analytics yourself, sneak in there. Um, what inevitably happens is people don't really believe the results, and it's really hard to get support. And so much of your role as a product manager is like building understanding and consensus. And sometimes the way to do that is do what you think is the wrong thing. Product management really is a influence without authority type role, and that really takes
mm,
some getting used to. So, it's not your designer, it's not your engineering manager, your engineers. These people are your peers, and certainly you play a leadership role on the team. But it really is that sort of classic style of servant leadership where you need to earn the trust of people because you don't kind of carry that stick of do what I say or you'll get fired, that ultimately underpins your
mm,
sort of a traditional chain of command. And so it really requires a lot more leadership and a lot more humility and a lot more time and storytelling. And I was really lucky at sort of one point in my career to be taken aside by one of the leaders, and who sort of sat me down and said, "Look, you're smart, you know what you're doing, but you come across too forcefully, and you're not really building
mm,
the trust and support of people around you." And looking back at that time, like I would really rely on, well, this seems like the right thing to do, and would really kind of push for that, and would try and win every sort of single argument because it was sort of good for the
mhm,
company or right for the company, or in some cases just right for me. And I think what I've learned, and what I coach and the product managers that I work with is that it's really, really important to build the trust and support of your engineering and design partners, of UX, of analytics, of marketing, of sales, of all those folks. And what that means is you won't always do exactly what you think the sort of right answer is. Right, I think a classic early product manager mistake is to say, well, this is my product and sort of this reflects me, and anything we do that I don't love is wrong. Like ultimately, it's a team exercise, and it's your job to
mm,
influence and build the team. And that may mean doing things that you may not necessarily agree with all the time, and you're far better to disagree and commit and learn quickly And I can think of many instances when I've shipped stuff that I didn't necessarily if I were, solely in charge, I don't think I would have done, but it was really important because someone on our team was passionate, or a partner was passionate, or there was some sort of other reason that this was really important that we do that. And, sometimes it doesn't work as I expected. And, like I didn't think it would work and it doesn't work. And so, you don't quite get the "I told you so," but, what we have done at that point is we've built the kind of understanding and support. Like, I had looked at data and, I talked to customers and believed something was true, but other people, weren't happy with that evidence. And so it was important that we, to get everyone aligned, we go and build something. And other times, I've been adamant something wouldn't work and it totally worked really well. And, I've been able to update my, kind of view of the world and say, wow, like I'm really pleased we did that, because, if it's just my call, we totally wouldn't have. And so, yeah, I think, bringing that sense of humility is really important. And I think to an understanding that, a team that's highly aligned and shipping frequently, even if they ship the wrong things, maybe as much as half the time, will actually learn very quickly. And I think what I've certainly seen is organizations that were sort of, that sales and product didn't agree, or kind of marketing had a different view and was sort of selling something different to what was being built. You're much better being highly aligned and, exploring a few different directions, learning quickly and course correcting, than you are spending like a huge amount of time, trying to make sure that you make the right decision for everything that you ship. Like that idea of, building, shipping, learning is really, really important.
So how do you give away what sounds like some of the control over what ships and what doesn't, but still maintain as the product manager the overall direction that's going to work for both the business and the user?
Well, I think as product manager, you actually never control what's being shipped. Like you don't design it, you're not going to build it. And so ultimately you need to convince other people to design the product and build the product. And so I think that that's the sort of fundamental misunderstanding. This like, oh, you're the CEO of the product, everyone has to do what you say. Like that was never true to begin with. And so really it's like,
where did that come from?
I don't know exactly where it came from. And I think sort of some aspects of it are really kind of important in the sense of, thinking kind of holistically about the product and being able to, really take extreme ownership of everything that's happening and slot into places, where you're needed. And in some senses, that's kind of exactly what a CEO does, right? Like I think when we think CEO of the product, we think that kind of, gross old version of kind of large command and control companies with the sort of private jets and executive bathrooms and sort of everyone cowering in fear. Whereas I think if you think of kind of modern CEOs that I've worked with, like they really do, the way that they work with their executives, they'll do things that maybe, wouldn't be their call, but they absolutely support their executives and understand that, they've got to give them the freedom to run their organizations. And, they'll learn quickly if in fact they do things, that maybe don't pan out. I think it's sort of rooted in like the wrong idea of what a CEO does or how in fact, really good CEOs do lead. And, then that just gets sort of transferred to product.
What's a more helpful or contemporary way of looking at the role of product manager, or a metaphor to think about what you can do to be effective in that role?
Yeah. I think it's that it's almost more like, I wish I had a nice off-the-shelf metaphor. The thing I think about is like when you're organizing a group of your friends to go on holiday, like that's kind of the metaphor, right? Like you have a sense of it'd be fun to go, somewhere beachy on holiday, over the Easter break or, over New Year's Day or something. And you've got some kind of a vision. And so it's really helpful and really important to have a vision of like, hey, I'm thinking it'll be pretty chill. We might have a couple of nights of partying, but mostly it's going to be really relaxing and restorative. And, we're going to get a house that we sort of optimize for location to the beach, and maybe it's not quite as nice or it's a bit smaller. Like there's some sort of a vision that you're pitching to people, which can really help to sort of align, someone kind of align everyone and not have these very divergent like let's go and have a crazy party trip, or like I want to go and get work done, or let's go with the kids, or whatever it is. It's important to have some sort of a vision, but ultimately these people have to choose to sort of go with you, and you are going to have things that's not quite what you would have expected or something like that. But ultimately, your job is to like facilitate this group of people to a decision, and you can have some influence. But ultimately, everyone's got to sit down and say, yes, we agree with this, and this is what we want to do. And you're there in service of the larger group. You can make suggestions and pitches, but ultimately, if they want to do it or don't want to do it, is up to them. And so I think that kind of model where you have to really sort of lead through kind of inspiration and vision, and like, hey, here's how I'm thinking about things, and here's why I think it might make sense for us to sort of organize events in this way, or like I think kind of cards would be fun for this reason, or whatever it is. And also realizing that you're not always going to be right. Like your perfect sort of artiste vision is not going to be realized. And ultimately, like the goal is a holiday that everyone enjoyed, and not the realization of your sort of perfect vision.
It sounds like a very difficult role in the sense that you don't have a lot of control. You've got to bring people along, as you said, for the journey, make it feel like they've decided to do things. And in reality, they probably will have decided to do a bunch of stuff on the product, but you ultimately don't control them. How does that play out in terms of your well-being as someone who's been in a senior product management role or roles before? Like, how do you look after yourself and make sure that you're able to articulate that vision and bring the energy that you need to in order to bring the product and the team to greater success?
I think energies, it is a great way to frame it. Like, energy from a PM is really important. And I've often seen this from just the day-to-day of the Scrum team coming in, being excited, and being able to remind the team that, okay, we're not just making bricks, we're contributing to building a cathedral here. And I think that like I'm definitely down that chain of I have a meditation practice, and I know that if I can get out and exercise at least 4 days a week, like I'm kind of much better and much happier. And also that I think also there was a realization for me that, like, a little bit like we talked about previously, I don't actually control everything. And so when I sort of put it on myself, I have to make these people do this thing. I certainly found that very stressful. Versus, a reframing of that I've taken recently is, look, I'm going to show up and really just do my best. And I'm going to kind of help nudge people in the right direction as much as possible. And as long as we go broadly in the right direction, and we may do some things that I didn't agree with, or my kind of boss, I'm going to be able to get my boss on board with something that's actually really, really important. That's okay. Like, as long as we're just sort of like we're continually learning, and as long as we're aligning, and as long as we're moving forward, that's actually progress, not this kind of like, this product is my baby and represents myself, and I need to sort of actualize myself through it. Like, that's the stuff that gets you in trouble, I think. So, it's a combination of just the basic sort of, knowing the stuff that sort of helps you. And also, I think, framing what it is that you're doing as like, yeah, this is, you're in the middle of the way the sausage gets made, and it's a bunch of trade-offs. And, there was a New Zealand politician that talked about politics as the art of the possible. And I think it's the same thing for, organizations. Like, I've certainly had things that I've, pitched for many months, and, won no support, and then slowly got maybe a little proof of concept. And then eventually these things were kind of built out into, whole product lines in some cases. But it just took a lot of like slowly persuading, convincing, and just being willing to kind of offer this idea and, continually refine how I pitch this, because, ultimately if someone doesn't understand something, that's on me as the communicator. It's not for me to say, well, they're dumb, or why don't they get it? Like, that's not helpful. Like, if I want them to understand something, that's on me to find new ways to communicate that.
Yeah, that's actually a really insightful point, and it's something that if you're listening to this episode, you should really take away. I think you get a lot of value out of applying that into your own life if you're not already. Now, Robbie, you've worked at several large, well-known product organizations. You mentioned Zynga. I mentioned in your introduction SurveyMonkey and Intercom. You also have worked in New Zealand and in the US, so you've seen a bunch of different cultures and ways of doing things. Thinking about those experiences, what does a world-class product organization look like?
That's a great question. I think what are the characteristics of a world-class product organization? I think highly aligned is certainly one characteristic. So I've worked at organizations where there was this very much decentralized, like you own this piece of the product, you figure out the strategy, and people would be going in a million different sort of directions and sort of optimizing for their own metrics. I think really good product leadership sort of steps up, and really good company leadership will have like quite a clear strategy, and not a strategy in the sense of our strategy is to grow margins, but it really seems like a real story. Like I think of kind of strategy is a term that can be thrown around a lot, but ultimately it's like a story about how you're going to achieve what it is you think you're going to do, right? Amazon's strategy being to have like a really wide range of items available and make them, get to our customers really quickly. And so, and just have like really great customer experiences throughout, and always take the view that, hey, if the customer's upset, that's their fault for not messaging correctly or not setting expectations or whatever else. And that's like the qualitative story. Now there's other ways you could have done that. You could have had like a one-on-one concierge kind of system, or hey, we're going to create great margins by like kind of selling lots of items at really high prices, because they're hard to find items. There's tons of different stories you can imagine, but that was uniquely Amazon's. And, I think as a company, you want to make sure your company has that, and certainly a product organization needs to have that of like, how is it that we are going to create value? Like, what do we do for customers truly? Paired to that, I think, is an understanding at the level of the job that you do. And so not like, we build an SMS system, but, we help direct to consumer retailers to communicate with their customers. Like that's the job that we're doing. We're agnostic about whether it's SMS or it's push notifications or it's email or carrier pigeon or whatever. But if you sort of understand the job, then you're able to understand, different parts around the problem and, what you really compete with. That job understanding I found is a really, really, really rich one for organizations to have. And it's really important that a world-class product team has a sense of, what problem they're solving for customers and what the job they're doing is. I think a real focus on problems. Like I know we've sort of chatted about this before, but focusing on the customer problem, like what is it that someone's trying to do? What's the progress they're trying to make in their lives, rather than being sort of feature focused, like, we need to build notifications. Ultimately, I think one of the biggest sources of value you can create as a PM is just really clearly defining the problem, that you want to work on, and being able to identify that, requires an understanding of your customer. A really deep understanding of your customer, and likely requires more research. So a kind of real problem focus, I think, is extremely important. Really strong connections with stakeholders, and so a sense of like the product is being really attached to the rest of the organization. Like often you'll hear sort of product throwing stuff over the wall to sales, or maybe they're sort of the kind of tail that is just sort of constantly trying to organize sales requests together into one place. Like a really good understanding and a partnership. And that's where the company strategy comes in, to make sure that marketing's selling what product's building, and same thing with sales, and everyone's aligned about like, hey, these are the customers we're really going after, and these are the ones we're sort of going after opportunistically. What else? I think like a clear and really well understood process. And so I think having and this ultimately helps for alignment within that triad of like product design and engineering, to say that product needs to step up and say like, these are the ways, these are the stages that each project is going to go through. And I think being quite prescriptive about the stage, but quite open about the form that it takes. And so this is less a series of sort of templates to be filled out or spreadsheets or kind of forms, and much more like, hey, this is the so maybe validation. Like every time we define a problem, we take some validation step, and that could be look at a couple of support tickets. It could be 3 months of formative research. And the form can really change, but each step qualitatively, you've kind of undertaken that step of validating that the problem exists. Those are things that are top of mind right now, but I'm sure there's much more as well that would kind of characterize a world-class product org.
And those are some great things, I think, if people are looking for their next role in product, to consider when they're interviewing, and to ask about and try and get a sense of as they move into their next role.
Maybe actually one thing, sorry, Brendan, just to add in here actually as well. I'm just thinking about what are the things which can go wrong and you should look out for. Ultimately, it's a focus on results, right? Like product's about making something people want. And so a good product is one that, people use, they use a lot, and, that grows. And so I think that, your product has to have a real focus on sort of top level results, and not just like, hey, we shipped a lot of features, not just focused on output, but it's got to be, hey, look, we solved these problems for these customers, and that drove revenue for our organization. Like, I think really great product organizations have a clear focus on that as well.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a mindset, and it also plays out from the way that you've described that and the language people use to talk about and describe what it is that they do.
I think that's fair.
Robbie, you also mentioned in what you were just describing there that there are often problems in product, and that lends to this notion of prioritization, and the product manager seems to be the role where that responsibility falls on the most. I've heard you speak about this idea that in product that everything is on fire, so it really becomes a question of what fire to let burn. In your experience, how have you approached that decision of what fires to let burn and what ones to try and put out?
I mean, I think this comes back to like just a really good understanding of your customer and like a really clear strategy. And so, the fires that you can't let burn are those things that your customers come to you for. Because, if you're a new product, likely there's lots of features that you don't have. And the whole way that products get started is because they're so much better in one area, and they solve something that's such a pressing problem that customers are willing to kind of give up everything else. They're not sort of worried about the other things that you don't do because you do that one or two things really well. And generally it's the case that in products, only a couple of things that you do that make the difference. And there's lots of things that, help, or, they sort of need to, but don't really make a large difference. And so I think the core of prioritization is like a really clear understanding of like what actually matters here. Does the beauty of and the kind of, how visually arresting the site is, does that matter? And in what parts? Or is it like, look, we can get a B there. Obviously, it's got a meter bar, but we don't get extra points for winning it. Does site speed, does it really, really matter? Or is it we've just got to be like not bad on? Some products site speed is super important. Others, it's like, yeah, it shouldn't be super laggy, but like, you're not gonna win by kind of exceeding on those dimensions. And so if you've got a really good understanding of those things, then I think the prioritization starts to become a little bit simpler. And to our discussion earlier, you mentioned that the PM's often responsible for prioritizing. Product managers don't, like, it's not a thing you go and train for. And so product managers don't inherently have any more skill at this necessarily. Or sort of insight than anyone else does. And so I'd almost think of them more as like the chairman of the board, or they're just the sort of chair of this meeting that could include a pretty wide range of stakeholders, all of whom need to be bought into the way the prioritization happens. And so if PMs find themselves sort of putting their business card on the table and going, well, we're going to do X because I'm the PM and I say that it's my job to decide that. A little bit like if you ever hear design saying, well, I want it to be purple because I'm the designer and I get to choose that. Like, something's gone pretty wrong. Really what PM should be doing is kind of working with all these different stakeholders, and sort of ideally everyone should agree, or at least pretty much understand. They may not completely agree, but broadly they can get behind, like, I understand what we're prioritizing and why. And I think also, being willing to hold it lightly, because what's really important is the sort of top 2 or 3 things that you're focused on that you need to get right, and focusing on those. And it's really important that you do those 3 things, and that you don't do something that's not on that list. But within that list, like, should something be the second priority or the first priority? Like, I don't think anyone really knows. And so, being willing to hold that lightly and go, yeah, you know what, like, this is an important thing. I think we should do it. But sales really, really want it right now. And so we're going to bring that up the roadmap, a little bit, to sort of make them happy and build goodwill. Like, that's exactly what PM should be doing. And that's really a really positive step. Or like, design's really passionate about this, and they've kind of had a bit of a tough quarter, so we'll just sort of bump this project up. Sort of reorganizing within that like circle of things that, all of which are probably, pretty good to do. Is totally fine. But the job really is making sure that stuff doesn't creep on that actually isn't important or isn't going to take us in the direction and build the product that we want to, and help better solve the customer problems that we've decided we're going after. So yeah, that's how I sort of think about prioritization. I think it's more about the story, more than it is. I'm actually a big, whatever the opposite of a proponent is, of these kind of like impact and confidence and wait a short job first, kind of prioritization frameworks, because what you always find is that the sort of potential impact of a feature, you're always just guessing at or making up. And so, this is rated as a 7 versus a 6. Like that's a very sort of squishy step in that whole process.
Mm-hmm.
And so, qualitatively having an area in which like, hey, it's really important. Like, people are going to choose our product because it's the fastest. And so, this project may or may not work, but like ultimately it's working towards site speed. And so we know if we do enough of these, we'll be doing good things versus doing like a redesign of the site, which like looking at the day doesn't matter how pretty the site is. If it's not quick, we're not going to win. And we can have a really ugly site and people will still use it if it's quick. So that qualitative understanding is more important than a kind of some sort of made up calculation of what we think the impact a particular project might have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you really have to know what those things are that are going to make the products successful. Those core things are, hold those front of mind, and also be comfortable. You've mentioned this a couple of times now, and this sort of notion of trade-off, be comfortable with trading things off, and sometimes for softer reasons, the good of the team, as opposed to what you may want as the product manager.
Yeah, and I think the key part there is like trading off within the kind of circle of acceptable, so like there's 50 ideas and all of them are probably good on some level, but there's 5 that are really important. Within that 5, like the order can be kind of whatever, but it's really important that you don't go doing other stuff, within that.
Got it.
So realize that often locally, a few equally important things, and you probably won't know the answer anyway, and so let's just sort of try and kind of come to some agreement around that, but it's super important that you don't get distracted.
Yeah, you just can't know. That's something that people are generally not that comfortable with. So sometimes you just have to try.
Yeah,
well, Robbie,
exactly.
You're a bit of an expert on product management for onboarding experiences. That's been a large part of your role at Intercom. You've written a lot about this and given several talks about this as well. Just for the people listening, in case there's any ambiguity about this, what is product onboarding?
So product onboarding, I think of as, taking someone that's come to your website and has clicked try. They're, especially in my world, B2B SaaS, they've probably got some sort of a problem that your product can solve, because it would be a pretty, twist is the wrong word, but like it would be unusual for someone to just be sort of trying out software as a service products, that are aimed at businesses just for fun. Like, and generally they kind of, if they walk on the lot, they have a problem that you can solve. And so taking that person all the way from someone who's interested in the promises of your website to someone that's actually experiencing the value of the product on your website. And so that's, someone that's sort of fully using your product to the best of its abilities for the problems that customer has. So it's not just, of that a subcomponent is the first use experience, which is maybe the first 1 or 2 sessions. But like I think of onboarding as taking someone from the promises of the website to really getting the most they can for the problems they have out of your product.
Yeah, and there are thousands, if not more, products, particularly in B2B SaaS, out there at the moment. What separates those that have a great onboarding experience from ones that have an average one?
So I think the secret to like a really good onboarding experience is just understanding what customers want at that point. And in many cases, it's about helping the customer either experience the value of the product really quickly, or it's about helping them sort of understand what that might be. And so the difference there is that, like for consumer products like Pinterest or Facebook, rather than sort of telling people a lot about how it can help, like the best way to experience Facebook is just sort of sign up, add a few people, and you'll get it pretty quickly. Stuff will show up in your newsfeed, you'll get messages, like you'll understand the value and you'll kind of know if it's for you or not. You'll get that magic moment of like interacting with friends. One of the unique things about kind of B2B products is that they're often pretty complicated. And so there may be like a large sort of setup process or some quite complicated installation process. I like to think of the Airbnb host experience as a really good kind of relatable example of this. So, if you wanted to host your space on Airbnb, there's actually a lot you've got to do. It's not like we can go, oh, cool, let's just, we'll get someone in to sort of sleep in your house tonight. Like, that'll be cool. Like, well, we can't do that. It's not possible. And so, what a really good Airbnb host onboarding has to have is be able to help someone understand, and make it really real. Here's the benefit, or help them see how they could realize that benefit of like kind of monetizing an empty space in their house, and help them see how they could overcome all those kind of fears and things that are holding them back. Like, well, is it going to be safe? And what if, do I get to vet who comes through this process? All that. And so like a really good first use experience for Airbnb host would sort of help someone really quickly understand, like, here's how much money you could make with your space, and here's how easy it's going to be to manage it, and whatever other kind of the top 5 questions someone has when they kind of click that button. Like a good onboarding experience there is going to really convince someone that this experience will actually do what it promises, and so therefore they're willing to do all the work of like wrangling with a calendar and writing a blurb and uploading the photos and sort of having a back and forth chat with randoms. It's about building that kind of conviction, which usually is about sort of helping show the product in really specific ways and make it real for those people.
So that makes a lot of sense. You've spoken about, and we read a lot about in product, this notion that it's important to understand what the customer is trying to achieve, what their problems are, and there's really important to do that during the onboarding experience in order to deliver value during that critical moment. But let's get really practical. How, as the product manager, do you go about trying to understand what those problems are? How do you frame this? How do you put it in terms that's meaningful and actionable for the team in order to try things out and deliver on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the first thing to understand is that the new user experience and the problems we solve for a new user may be quite different to the actual kind of core problem that's being solved. So if we go back to the Airbnb experience, like the job to be done there is probably like, when I've got a spare space in the house, I want to sort of easily and safely kind of make money out of that space. And that's probably the job to be done, or I want to supplement my income, something like that. Whereas by contrast, when you're shopping for something like Airbnb, maybe a range of other sort of questions you might have, where it's like, I need to validate with my partner that it's okay that we do this. And so I have to sort of essentially pitch to them and get their agreement to do this. And I want to know what happens if something goes wrong. And there's always kind of like concerns and fears and anxieties and things like that. And so the first thing is that, like, the needs of a sort of first-time user are often quite different and unique to someone that's already using the product. And so it may just not be, explaining what it does when you're using it day to day, but there may be a range of really sort of set up specific kind of needs. And, the classic one for B2B in this being like, often if you're thinking about adopting a new product, someone may investigate it and they'll sort of, pitch it to maybe a decision committee, who'll then like make a decision, then negotiate a contract, and only then go and implement the product. And so your onboarding needs to help people get through that like decision-making process. Like, here's a little calculator to help you understand how much, value you could get with this product, or, here's how it would look on your website, or whatever it would be, stuff that isn't sort of necessarily just about like kind of, let's set up our product right now and get going, but actually is helping with the problems in that like actual buying process.
So how do you frame those problems? So how do you go about defining those? I mean, I suppose it's somewhat easy to look at an existing product and kind of tease those out. But when you're in the trenches building the product, how do you actually get from what they are assumed to be to actually what they are, and iterate on top of those?
Yeah, so it's really critical, not to sort of guess at this point, and talking to customers is absolutely critical here. The process I really like for this is the switch script interview, which is, I think well characterized by Bob Moester and the Rewired group, who are sort of some of the early proponents of jobs to be done. And what a switch script interview will do is it kind of takes a customer, or often like someone that's sort of newly signed up, and will really dig deeply into like, well, when did you first think about kind of finding a solution to this? And then what did you do? How did you go about kind of casting around for particular alternatives? And what was the progress in your life that you were trying to make? This idea that people don't want to drill, they want holes in their wall or whatever it is, and that the drill is a thing they may choose to solve that particular problem. But really getting into the nitty gritty of that process and if you think about the B2B buying process, it might be, well, it's actually often usually there's some sort of failure within the company or some big event, someone missed a quarter and they're like, hey, we've really got to improve here. And then that, set in motion some sort of process. And so sort of understanding that helps you align your marketing, helps align your product, like all these sorts of things. When you understand like what is it that someone comes to you for and what's the progress they're looking to make, what's the job to be done when they're buying, and also what are the various steps, like who are all the different people involved in the process, and what information do they want at each stage? Because I think that's the sort of classic mistake of many kind of complex product-led companies will be like, when you click that start trial button or something like that, they'll have you like set up the actual product. And in many cases, what people want is something more akin to a demo than actually sort of setting up the product. I mean, I guess in some ways a trial always is a demo. It's just that, someone setting up the product themselves may not be the most effective way to demo at that point. It may be that they want sort of a slightly, kind of more detailed explanation or something they can play with a little bit, more than the marketing side, but they don't actually want to necessarily like get started. And I think that's what, if you look at a lot of kind of onboarding flows, it's almost like that team is assuming that that person has already made a purchase decision. And so, they'll often have like lots of API keys to install or just hard, difficult work that doesn't actually prove value up front. And that's really the wrong way to think about it. Like when someone, modern companies are all about a light marketing site and trying to get you into the product as soon as possible. And what that means is that person hasn't decided to buy. At that point, they're just a prospect, they're interested. And so your goal is to really, really easily and quickly help make the progress that your product could help that person make in their lives feel as real as possible with as little work as possible. And only
now there's a great takeaway. There is a great takeaway for people listening. That's a huge point.
Yeah, I think that's a really big one. And I think of all the things in onboarding, like really trying to help make, that progress real. And you can, an easy audit for yourself is like at every stage, like, does this make me more confident that your product will do the thing that was on your marketing website? And if it doesn't, like, do you really need that step? Because early on, people haven't invested a whole lot, right? Like maybe the first page is like, create an account. Like, why do you really need to create an account? Could we not do this stuff logged out? And it doesn't need to be a lot. It could be sort of 3 or 4 tasks to help you sort of make some decisions about how you might configure this thing and help you, kind of get your mindset in the fact of, oh, this product could really help me. This is what I want. And maybe then it's like, hey, do you want to save your progress? Let's create an account. And so you can come back to this, or maybe you can show it to someone else if, there's not a person involved in the buying process, but just really thinking hard about like, how would I show someone, that this is going to work for them with as little effort as possible on their part. In the early days, it certainly should be doing that for the first sort of 5 minutes of the experience, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds like you need to have a really strong qualitative and rich insight into what the jobs to be done are of the customer or the users that you're trying to onboard. But how do you quantify, once you've understood that, or you believe you've understood that, and you put it out there into the product, how do you quantify whether or not you've been successful in those assumptions that you're now testing?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's like, is it driving more revenue? If you're a commercial product, is fundamentally the bottom line. Sometimes you'll be working on intermediate steps to that. So if you're doing something that involves churn or retention, it's almost impossible to sort of measure that. It's just very, very hard, and you're looking for very small changes. And so the way I'd think about that is basically working through that kind of backwards through that chain of logic, which is to say, like, if we're trying to onboard someone, where in the process were we focused? Like maybe it was getting more people who have met our definition of activated to then convert. And so like that's the little kind of number you'd be looking at. Or maybe it's what you're trying to do is get more people activated, and so you're focused on that. When you're evaluating this stuff, it's really important to make sure that the problem that you're solving is pretty well tied to the metrics that you're measuring. So for example, let's say you're working on, the first use experience, and what you found is that there was certain people in the, e-commerce industry really struggled to see how your product could be relevant to them. A bad way to measure that, and your goal was sort of activation, like those people were just bouncing, they weren't even kind of activating. A bad way to measure that would say, like, did the overall activation rate go up? The reason that's bad is there's lots of things that could affect the activation rate, and who you were targeting was really specifically e-commerce companies. And so what you want to do is sort of look at like, okay, if we had some new feature that explained, things better for e-commerce companies, did we see a change in activation rate for those e-commerce companies? Like it's really important to drill into that level of detail, so you don't get lost in the noise of random fluctuations or sort of anything like that. And that can apply to like, maybe you're trying to work on one specific step, getting people that have installed your product to kind of like, well, they've used it once to use it multiple times. Like you really want to focus on like who is that kind of targeted group rather than relying on these like kind of high level numbers, because in anything but the largest products, like kind of global Facebook scale, it can be very, very hard to get statistically significant results on these measures. And so really trying to hone in on your target group and say, can we move things for them?
So you really have to tightly define who that is and tightly define the experiment in order to get any sort of validity out of the metrics that may result.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where focusing on the customer problem becomes, kind of important. We've talked so much about like the job to be done and what do people want in the step and having a clear hypothesis. But, on the ground, a lot of these things will look like we're going to redo the nav because the nav's confusing on our marketing site, and that'll have impact. And like that could be the right answer, but really what you want to do is sort of have an understanding of like, there's a particular sort of customer that finds like these two buttons kind of confusing, or they're looking for case studies, but we call them resources, and they don't understand that case studies go into resources, and so we're going to rename resources case studies. Like I don't know what it is. But then you would.
This is classic Steve Krug. Steve Krug talks about when you identify a usability issue, you should be thinking about what's the smallest possible thing we can do to resolve that issue rather than redesign.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, 1,000%. Like a redesign should be the sort of thing of last resort. But more generally, projects that are just like redesign is it's sort of inspecific, because what you actually want to start with is like, here are the problems that we want to solve, and really it's only when you get to design should you come to the conclusion, and it should be pretty easy to agree like, hey, we actually can't solve this with our existing design. We do need to like abstract up and kind of solve it at a sort of a higher level, and at that point there should be no arguments about the redesign. It's when you're sort of pitching our marketing site's just super broken. Like what's broken about it? Like what are people trying to find and what can't they find? Because
be specific.
Yeah, because the specificity actually allows you to then evaluate the success of it, right? And it's sort of when you say, we're going to build better onboarding or make it shorter or sort of something like that, that's sort of like a vague solution without any real clear problem. Who's it for? What's the progress they were trying to make? And what's the problem with the status quo? Like if you've got those parts, then it's quite easy to sort of, or in many cases, it's much easier to sort of define metrics for how you would see, yes, these sort of people are, maybe it's like visitors from Quora tended to have this problem, and so you can look at all your traffic being referred from Quora and say like, hey, are they actually able to get to case studies at a much higher rate than they were previously? Like, I don't know what this is, but it's like if you actually understand the kind of qualitative specifics, then kind of designing metrics that would quite easily allow you to see this stuff is sort of much easier, rather than saying, well, we're going to redesign the nav and try and see an increase in site-wide conversion, because like it just doesn't happen. It's just so hard to measure that.
This sounds a lot like iteration as opposed to innovation. Is there a role at all for innovation in something like onboarding?
Look, absolutely. I think the way to think about it, there's a great blog post by Scott Belsky, who I think is or was the chief product officer at Adobe, called The First Mile of Product. That talks a lot about these kind of pieces that I highly recommend to your watchers or listeners or whatever they might be. But like a really good frame from sort of Scott was the idea that sort of familiarity helps adoption, and innovation is really great at kind of doing things in a new and different way. And so if you want to make people adopt something, make it familiar. And so I think in that sense, like what onboarding should do is like bridge your new world and what people know. So it absolutely has to start at the like frames of reference and terms that the general population or whoever it is that's coming to your product understand, and help them rather than using the sort of terms and definitions that sort of is unique to your product. As an example, at Intercom, we call like the way that Salesforce and Intercom interact an app, like an application. Now, most people think about that as an integration. Like integration is the word that kind of, do you have a HubSpot integration? Do you, whatever. And so in onboarding, like we had this whole, a debate about like, well, should we call them apps because that actually helps build a better mental model for how our product works, or should we call them integrations? And essentially the question we asked ourselves was like, is it important, like when someone's starting out with Intercom and is just really trying to like, get a sense of like, will this give me value? Does explain to them that we actually, in fact, what you think's in integration, we call an app. Like our terms and definitions is not an important thing to land. Like we can land that further down the track, right? Once they've signed the deal, they've had the trial, we can go, oh, actually, if you're using this, by the way, integrations live in this kind of apps thing. But I'd much rather have someone understand and be able to use, our product rather than and be a little bit confused about like, where to find integrations later on. Like that's a problem I'd much rather have than, someone not become a customer.
That's kind of catching and couching that ego of the wider organization before it's let loose on the general public.
Yeah, 1,000%. It's really about kind of meeting people where they are, and also remembering that, and this is true of kind of products in general. I think innovation for its own sake is probably not helpful in general. Like ideally, like a great product sort of works and is sort of familiar to people and works in all the same ways that they're sort of used to. But because it's new, it's got to in some way be different. And so if something's completely different, right? Like if the Mac computer had a Dvorak keyboard, that like layout that's supposed to be sort of more efficient or whatever, it wouldn't have taken off because it's just one more thing that makes it hard to adopt. They don't want to like learn to reuse a keyboard, that kind of thing, even though like technically it might be a better product. If you go back and say like, what is it that makes a Mac different? Like typing speed is not it. It's not central to that value prop, and so they haven't done it. And so I think in general, whether it's onboarding or your product in general, those core things that you do different and that you do better, make them different if you can be, and then make everything else as standard and familiar as you possibly can, because it just reduces the amount of kind of barriers to new people understanding your product. Like use standard UI, like don't innovate and that kind of stuff, unless you have to for some reason, right? Like,
Google doesn't, muck around very often with how they present the core search results, and that's for a reason. I was just doing an evaluation of a website recently, and search was part of that, the search feature, and the design team had done something quite different to what people are used to. And one user just didn't even realize that what they were seeing was the results that had been returned from their search input.
Oh, wow.
And I mean that, like, to most people you might think that's crazy, but for this person it was real. They had to really think about it, and then eventually they got it, but it was just unnecessary friction.
Yes.
Something else that you spoke about, Robbie, that I thought was really interesting when I was preparing for today's talk was that there's this notion that there are jobs that are outside of the core job of the product that your users are trying to achieve, and that if you pay attention to those, you can unlock a lot of mutual value. And this is in the context of onboarding. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so the idea of jobs that are not central to your product is the fact that a lot of products will describe them, or if you actually look at the way that people use products, most products are actually a pretty limited sort of solution to the problem. And there'll be one tiny piece of workflow. So you think of SurveyMonkey, which is a pretty fully featured survey product. It's actually a pretty small part of the actual process of gaining insight over something. So let's say you wanted to sort of send a survey to someone, or you wanted to understand something about your customers, and you decided that a survey was the option there. You've got to figure out who to send it to. You've got to figure out who's going to use those results. You've got to figure out what information you want to learn from those people. You've got to figure out like which questions you should ask in order to get those results. You've got to figure out who to send it to. You've got to get their email addresses. Like SurveyMonkey doesn't help with any of that stuff. It's just it will allow you to, like, yes, you can build questions and you can send it to people and it will collect the results and it will put them in charts for you. But even then, like from the charts, often that goes, then you've got to kind of take the input, you got to synthesize it, make sense of it, you got to distribute it and share it with people. There's all this sort of stuff that's adjacent to it. You've got to remind people to take the survey that sort of haven't responded quite yet. Like there's just all this stuff that will actually be part of the sort of regular workflow, which your product often today doesn't really sort of solve. And so thinking about, as you're trying to move people to adopt it, helping people do that is often really important. So templates are like a really common kind of answer to this sort of problem. Like typically most things like allow you to do something, most products allow you to do something, but you've got to put something. There'll be some kind of enter some text or create something and send it to someone type thing. And so like giving people ideas of like, well, here's what you might want to write and here's who you might like to send it to you. And by the way, here's, where you can get that information from. As a super practical example, Intercom, sort of where I work, if people aren't familiar with it, it's most people know it as that little chat bubble that sits in the bottom right corner of websites on the internet. And really we view that as a way to, for businesses to talk to their customers for sales, marketing, and support. All the ways you can talk to your customers, one of the things that'll happen is like, how does your customers' information wind up in there? Because from the very start, we've had this kind of chat bubble which exists as a JavaScript snippet on your website, that most people don't install it like at the very beginning of their business, and so people will have some existing customers who aren't in Intercom, and the only way to get those people in was to sort of somehow force them to visit your website and then capture information and you can message them. And so one of the best things we ever did for onboarding was provide a CSV upload button where you could upload a list of existing kind of users and we dedupe it against people that we've already seen, and so you could actually have a comprehensive user list. Like this is an example of something that's sort of outside the product. It's and it's easy to sort of overlook and think, well, we need to add this feature or that feature. But in actual fact, it was just this really basic problem is, we say we're one place to see all your users, but like, our customers couldn't get all their users into Intercom. And so like that's an example of the sort of thing that's about understanding like what's outside the product and how do we help people, overcome those gaps, which can seem, pretty pedestrian, but often are, really, really important to overcome.
And that's not something that I get the sense that your product analytics would tell you.
Well, no, I mean, this is the thing, like this goes back to our like quant qual discussion, right? So product analytics tell you what people do, and they're really good at that, but it doesn't tell you why people do a particular thing. And both those things are really important. Just knowing that there's some people that want to do a certain thing, all these jobs to be done, it's kind of helpful, but you may not know how many people have that particular job or whatever else, or even equally interviewing people and trying to understand like which part of the product they got stuck on may not be particularly reliable. Analytics are really good at telling you like who's seen what screen, but they just really won't tell you why they didn't go any further or what happened at that point or what was confusing to them about that screen.
Or what they're doing in other products and trying to make whatever they're trying to do work on your product. It's outside of the bounds of that analytics.
Yeah, completely. And if you're just looking at product analytics, you often end up in guessing land, right? Of like you'll get in a room and go like, well, why might people not be kind of completing this form? And the answer is always just change something in the product. Let's redesign the page, and it's like, I don't know, redesign the page is like sort of throwing all the Lego bricks up and just like putting them in a different place. Like, like how do you redesign it? I don't know, like just anything that's not what it is right now would be a redesign, and it like may or may not work. You just happen to luck on the thing that was confusing. Whereas if you actually go and talk to customers and they go, people were really confused because they wanted to select a certain thing in this drop down and they couldn't find it, or people couldn't find this button, or like whatever it is. If you have really specific feedback for like what should this redesign achieve today, what happens is people conflate these two ideas, and a really successful redesign would help people see this and know that these things are two separate ideas. And the points they miss, or like the understanding they're missing is ABC. That like again back to the real specificity of like what is it that people find this confusing versus like let's remove friction, right? Like what is frictionful? Let's get very specific and not just imagine it, but like talk to customers and understand to them what was hard here.
Robbie, this all sounds
While
like
we're
a
on,
lot of hard work.
it is.
I mean, it's so
Yeah, it
much
really
easier
is.
just to jump to conclusions and do things right and learn in production. Like, how do you
Yeah,
help people to operate and adopt this mindset?
yeah. I mean, it's actually much harder work to learn in product because you've actually got to put fingers on keyboards and build something, and
Mm.
um, people use it, and then it's like, oh, no one uses it. Like, that's a super expensive way to learn versus actually talking to your customers and saying, well, to use our onboarding example, talking to a few of them and saying, well, if I explain X, Y, and Z, does that help you? They're like, oh yeah, great, I'm ready to move to the next step. Okay, cool. Now have like really high confidence that if you built, the product thing or the screens that did, whatever I just explained, then that will work. Versus like going, oh, people, don't move from screen A to screen B. Let's imagine, what could the problem be? Whiteboard, bunch of ideas. That sounds fun. Build a thing, ship it. Oh, it hasn't, like we've moved people one screen further, but now they drop off at the next screen. We haven't achieved much at all, and so that's why,
Mm.
like, talking to customers is like can be a pain, but it's like the cheapest way to learn rather than actually building stuff. Um, you know,
Mm.
the if you're trying to find out what problem to solve, you have to talk to your customers. If you want to evaluate whether the solution works, then you've got to either like design it or build it. And so like it's
Mm.
important to figure out like, are we trying to, you know, do we know, do we know why people aren't activating or why they're churning? And if we don't do that, you've got to talk to people. If we know that, and we're just trying to say, well, how do we, um, you know, integrate with Salesforce so that large customers don't churn? And you've talked to them to understand like what they want out of Salesforce integration or what it is they're trying to achieve. Then at some point you have to build that thing to like understand, does it actually do what I thought it would? But that's sort of further down the track, and you already should have like a fair amount of confidence that this problem is worth solving.
Mm. This reminds me of my chat a couple of weeks ago with Marty Kagan, and he told me this story about Mark Andreessen when he was working for him at Netscape. And he considers Mark Andreessen to be one of the smartest person he's ever worked for. And he said that the penny dropped for him when Mark said to him, "You've got to know in product what you can't know." And I think that is exactly what you've just described there. And you've got to decide what to do when you realize that you don't know something and how to respond. Now, Robbie, I'm
Yes.
just mindful of time. I would love to have spoken to you today about growth and measuring growth, but instead, are you up for a few scenario-based questions out there that may be useful for people in product that are experiencing a relevant situation?
Let's do it.
All right, excellent. The first scenario is you're a rising star in your company, and this has given you a sense of self-confidence and some quite strong opinions. Others don't always share your opinion, and you've noticed that you've started to experience difficulty achieving the outcomes that you want. What do you do?
Ooh, that's a really good one. It's a very real one. Um, I think the trick there is just spending some time on relationship. So, really diagnose like why you aren't achieving those outcomes, and most likely if it's products, because like you're not getting people to sort of buy into your ideas or come along with that. And
Mm.
if you're fairly convinced that you have the sort of right answer, and you've done the work, that's probably about the non-doing the work stuff, and it's actually much more about the relationship you have with people. And so I think a few casual coffees, seeing how you can help others, of understanding where they're coming from. Most likely, if you're in this place, you'll find, oh, I actually haven't spoken to many people without asking them for something for quite a while. And
Mm.
so I think I'd be really trying to think about the relationship and sort of understand where people were, like, did they truly believe in the stuff that I was doing, and how could I help them with what
Mm.
they were concerned about. I think would be probably pretty important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and does sound pretty important. Are you ready for another?
Yeah.
All right, number 2, here we go. You've just been promoted to look after onboarding for your company's flagship product. You're a competent product manager, but it's your first time working in this area. What do you need to do or understand before you change anything?
Oh, um, what will happen here? I've been through this and I've seen this a few times. The sort of theoretical answer is you need to understand your customers better. And so you want to, ideally, you do like a bunch of research to understand, do a bunch of switch script interviews, like I talked about, trying to understand the progress that people are trying to make through the onboarding process. Almost certainly that won't be available. You'll be in a new product area. You haven't got a lot of credibility. There's no sort of research resource available. And so that's where what I'd do is I'd work with the team and try and be really scrappy. And so I'd recruit design, I'd recruit engineering. I'd get the whole team on board about like, let's really understand what's going on here so that we don't sort of ship stuff that no one uses. And go do your own interviews. And, maybe it's not as comprehensive as possible. Maybe you can get some research support. But just talk to a few customers, and it actually almost doesn't need to be that sophisticated. And you'll start to sort of hear some common themes about like what's frustrating the payment process, or like installation is kind of hard, and really try and refine that yourselves. And even if you're making it up, being very explicit about what you assume is wrong. And so again, like we think that nav is broken. It's like, well, what do you think is broken about the nav? And just even if it's just a hypothesis that's not validated, at least note it down and write it down, and then build and ship some stuff, build a little bit of credibility. And then, once you've got a few wins on the board, you'll kind of be able to say, because in the early days, like often the onboarding stuff's like super obvious. It's, there'll be huge things that, you could read online reviews or like reviews in the app store, or talk to just a couple of random customers you can harangue, and they'll all be like, oh, the pricing's confusing, or, I don't really want to install, or like, you don't actually, just read basic interviewing, basic switch script interviewing on the internet, and you'll make a ton of progress pretty quickly. And so it's important to understand your customers. You probably won't get the resource to do that initially, and so just doing a kind of your own job and trying to prove some progress, well then you'll make some progress, ship some cool stuff, and then you can kind of get by and just say, hey, look, this was great, but we just did these interviews ourselves, and like here's the 3 areas that we're still not really sure, and so we'd love further investment to kind of get some really research to go deep here. And then that's going to be much more compelling versus going like, hey, I can't do my job until I've done tons and tons and tons of research. The most stuff actually isn't that complicated, and it tends to be pretty clear pretty quickly. And so just talking to a few customers, 5, 10, honestly, is plenty, as long as they're the right people. Write your own SQL, dig them out, send them emails from your own email address. Honestly, that's fine. You'll start to sort of understand some patterns.
And so it sounds like get scrappy and also get out of the building, whether that's virtually or physically.
1,000% get out of the building. All the answers are outside the building.
Are you ready for the final one?
Yeah. What you got?
All right. Since you took over managing the onboarding product, you've come up against several different and competing agendas from sales, marketing, and other product teams as to what that experience should be like. How do you align those agendas?
Yeah, this is also not uncommon. So I think there's a couple bits here. So one part is that often the agendas will be like, you should build X, and with those, I'd really try and push the conversation back to like, what do you think the problem we should solve is? We'll never get a straight answer to that because normal people aren't trained to think in problems. But basically, I'd sort of sit down and work with them, and I'd say, oh, we think we need notifications, and just sort of tell them, okay, cool. Like, why do you think that? Or like, how would that help? Or what is it that isn't working today that notifications would solve? And if you really sort of sit with people and understand them, that for a start is just going to build like a ton of rapport, and people feeling heard is actually like probably half the battle in the product development process. I mean, certainly internally, just making people feel heard. Even if you don't do what they then recommended, they'll at least go, yeah, like at least you sort of understood what I was talking about. So the first bit is, trying to get to the problems, that the different kind of groups think are out there, and how they've come to that. Like, is that I think it'd be cool if, or like, I have 3 customers that tell this to me, and actually, if you'd like to talk to them, I'd be glad to refer you. Like, that's what you want to hear. What you don't want to hear is, I'm pretty sure we're losing deals because of X, but like, I can't really point to any specific one, but it's kind of the vibe. What you're looking for is, oh yeah, like here's 3 customers I could tell you off the top of my head, and I'd be glad to sort of intro you to them. So get to the problems, the underlying problems, and see if there's sort of similarities there. And then, like ultimately it's a job of trying to like align priorities around this. So hopefully, you could kind of work with leadership, and this is, like literally the role of like product directors is to kind of do this alignment at the sort of functional level around like, well, is sales, or like, what's the priority? Like winning more deals or reducing our support costs? Or is it, as a company, is it really important that we have the slickest experience or the fastest, like what is the kind of product direction from the company level? And then within that, you'll be able to say like, here's how we think we can help. Like we're primarily a sales sold company. And so we think that the job of onboarding is really to do a great job of, the demo, and that once you've actually bought, that experience is going to be a little bit janky, but there'll be a support manager with you anyway. And like you're pretty bought into the company by that point. And so we're not going to get a lot of extra points for having that be really slick, but we will if we can kind of help people demo online really well. Or, just as an example, or it's like, look, actually a sales team don't want people in the product. They want to be, they're really focused on very large enterprise deals that are sold outbound. And so we're totally focused on helping self-serve company, kind of customers. Or, like as an example from Intercom, I had a really close relationship with our support team, and they were always eager to have me do things that would reduce support ticket load, but just relative to other stuff that was happening, it just, was hard to make an impact. Like we were a very revenue focused team. And so if you look at the kind of almost like the cost saving of sort of support, like it just didn't really sort of stack up. And so it was on that basis that I was able to say to them, look, I'd love to help, and I think this is important, and we'll do it when we sort of can. Like if there's other stuff we're doing that we can slip this in for almost no cost, we'll absolutely help you out. But we can both agree that our job is revenue here, and like here's the bucket of money I see with your problem, and here's a bucket of money I see somewhere else, and we could probably both agree that I shouldn't work on your problem, even though like I know it's important to you. And so that kind of goes back to the like building understanding, and a sort of a common sort of being the chair of the decision making committee around prioritization, rather than saying like just computer says no.
It sounds like a yes and type approach.
Yeah, I mean it's validating, because I think the thing is like everyone likes being creative, everyone wants to be innovative, everyone likes building stuff, and often these ideas are good. Like it's very rare that I've had people come in with like blatantly stupid stuff. Often it might be a really misguided solution to a problem that's pretty real, or it might be something that's like a really interesting idea, but just not a priority right now. Or it's like pretty far off our target customer, but there is someone for whom it could be useful. There's always some kernel of kind of truth in this. And so really trying to acknowledge that with people, like, hey, it sounds like a really neat idea. We're not actually focused on, intercom for dogs right now, but, if we were selling to canines, like it makes a lot of sense to, translate the whole thing into woofs or send people dog biscuits, or you know what I mean? Like everything sort of makes sense in some context. Saying you're a massive idiot, don't you understand our target segment? Like that's not going to win you any friends. And so, yeah, I think product is shiny and people want to have an impact. And so just validating what people have said and, hey, I understand it, I see where you're going. And maybe even giving some light feedback of like, to be honest, like those people aren't our target customer and that's not me. Like, from the company level, you can see that. Or if you ask your boss or the head of sales, they will also say that that's not a priority, or whatever else. But interesting, fun, innovation thing. And if we have a little wiggle week or a hackathon, maybe we could work on that. Like that can be a kind of solution to that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so it really sounds like having a really clear product strategy is incredibly important in making those conversations much more productive and much easier.
Yeah, it's just a chain of logic from like, here's who we're selling to, here's what we think is important for them, and so therefore, pretty obviously, like it's important that we make and build these sort of things, and that does or doesn't fit into that ultimately.
That's your consultant coming out loud and strong there, Robbie.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of consulting, but ultimately, it's just about just making decisions within a business, and it's a qualitative understanding of how you have impact for for your customers. So yeah.
So what should a product manager never do?
What should a product manager never do? Definitely never put your business card on the table and go like, I'm a product manager, therefore I know X. It's like I always hate that term, product sense. Like I just don't, you may have experience with a particular customer and their types of problems, but I don't think you just look at a website and go, oh, you could make it better in this way. Like maybe, but that's just sort of like trying to be like a UX expert, or like, hey, this is more conventional, or like often you'll find that people do this or that. That's just sort of some weird sort of experience. I think that, yeah, ultimately it's about like, hey, here's the information I have, or here's the assumptions I'm making about our particular customers, and I believe it. My evidence base for it is all these conversations I've had, or, here's the thing that you assert's a problem that never once has come up, or I've never heard of before, and if I search our support tickets, I can never find it being there. Like, maybe it's a problem, but like usually it'll show up somewhere, or some competitor will have done something, that speaks to that sort of problem existing. So, yeah, just trying to put your business card on the table is certainly a thing you should never do. The other one is just like building anything that is like based on a judgment word. XYZ is broken. XYZ needs to be redesigned. XYZ is bad. XYZ is confusing. Like, don't just don't sort of start projects based on that or on solutions. Always start with like, here's the progress our customers are trying to make, and here's what's wrong about the status quo. And if you can't answer that, like you just don't know enough to get started, because your design team is going to try and design some solution, and it's going to be different in some way. And if it's not different in the way that solves whatever it is the actual problem is, then you're just kind of rearranging the different puzzle pieces, which is a very expensive way to waste time.
This is a great point to bring us down to my final question for you today, Robbie, which is thinking about where product management is today. What's your greatest hope for the profession over the coming years?
So I think getting better at aligning whole companies around jobs to be done, I think. Product management itself needs to do I think a much better job of really clearly articulating the problem to be solved, to empower the design team to do a good job, and bringing engineering along with that. But also, this is as applicable to sales and to marketing. And so I think in the future, what we'll see is this sort of idea of like the jobs and the progress we're trying to make will actually be kind of aligned throughout the organization. So our marketing side will speak to those sort of problems. Our sales team will be speaking about those problems in those scripts, and everyone will be kind of iterating and trying to update. And if they find, if the sales team find there's, a different pitch that resonates, then, we should surface that back to marketing, back to product, say, hey, I think we're now selling someone slightly different. And so maybe we need features to deal with that, or, kind of collateral to support that, but kind of viewing the whole organization as an entity to sort of understand and solve sort of problems. I think elevating that to the sort of exec level will certainly be something that I hope is something that we see more of in the future.
Yeah, makes sense. Robbie, thank you. This has been such a great conversation, packed with awesome stories and some really practical insights. Thank you for so generously sharing your knowledge and your experiences today.
This was a blast. Thanks so much, Brendan.
Look, I've got no doubt, Robbie, that people that have listened today will get a lot of value, especially product managers, from what you've shared. If people are interested in learning more about you and following your career and what you're up to, what is the best way for them to do that?
I'm on Twitter at RobbieDigi, and a bunch of my writing is on the Intercom blog. If you sort of go to the Intercom blog and search by author, you can check some of the stuff I've written there about jobs we've done, about problem statements, about onboarding, about a bunch of growth work, churn, better retention messaging, some stuff like that. Would love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks, Robbie. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff that we didn't get to today, so we'll have to do a round two at some point. To everyone that's listening, it's been great having you here as well. Everything that I've covered with Robbie today will be in the show notes, including where you can find him and also all the resources that we've touched on. If you enjoyed the show and you want to hear more great conversations like this from world-class leaders in UX, product, and design, don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe to the podcast. And until next time, keep being brave.